Welcome to the One Player Podcast, the show on solitaire board games. I'm your host, Albert. This is episode 340.
Painted minis work better than non-painted minis.
This is going to be a mini-sode, isn't it? Hello, Julius.
How are you doing, Albert?
All right, how are you?
I'm doing okay. I hear we're here to discuss a topic that both of us are deeply familiar with.
Yeah, this is going to go well. This is going to go down as one of the shows people should forget, I suspect.
I don't know about that. I think we'll handle it.
Episode 1 is probably one of those. This might be a second one. I don't know. Yeah, today we're talking about miniature games. And first up will be the discussion of what that means. Before that, though, a little bit of news. The One Player Podcast now has its playlist on YouTube. It's still all audio, but if you want to use YouTube, you could go there and watch it or listen to it that way. And you could also post comments there, which it already has lively discussion thread that's going on. So I will include the link in the show notes for anybody that's interested in that.
Wait, people are talking about it over there?
Yes, listener Shy Lev Avri, he asked for this so he could post comments as he's listening to the show and interact.
Huh.
So I said, okay, if you ask for it, I'll do it. I tried doing it before a while ago, and I couldn't figure it out for whatever reason. It was complicated. I just didn't feel like it. I don't know. But since somebody asked for it, I went ahead and looked into it and figured out how to do it and got it done.
Well, there you go.
So, like I said, I will include the links. All right, so now, enough stalling. On to the topic at hand. Miniatures games. What is a miniatures game, first of all?
So, Albert, I don't know if we're going to have the same definition of this because I don't know what your history in this is. But me, when I first came to Memphis, when I moved to Memphis from Israel, the first group of hobby gamers that I hooked up with were actually miniature gamers over at a local wargaming shop. And I would come and hang out, and often I would borrow armies for whatever sort of war game, usually skirmish level war games that they were playing. And I would enjoy playing miniature games over there. And that was several decades ago. It was a decade and a half ago, quite a while ago. It was quite a while ago that happened. It wasn't it wasn't the type of game that I thought was my favorite. For a number of reasons, and probably one of the biggest reasons was the expense and difficulty to maintain the components for all those things. Those were very much lifestyle type games, and I didn't want to have a lifestyle. I didn't want to have a lifestyle game like that and not be able to play all the other cool stuff out there. So I did end up sticking with it, but it was certainly a style of game that I enjoyed. So I feel like I at least have some familiarity with miniatures games. I don't know what your level of background with them are.
Yeah, that makes one of us then. I have played a few games in there. A few weeks ago, my son and I on May the 4th, we played X-Wing. That's a miniatures game.
It is.
So it was a big campaign. He wanted to do 200. He wanted to do like 400 points, and I talked him down to 200. And even that still took hours and hours and hours. It was a huge, massive, sprawling game. But yeah, and I did once go to a miniatures meet con, maybe not. Well, I guess it was a con, it was a meetup, and there's gaming there. And I played one game. Actually, I think I might have played two games, but the one I remember was playing. I forget what the is it the Boer War? It was. I don't think. No, it wasn't the Boer War. It was British against Zulus. And it was the guy had all this nice terrain, and the tables laid out with a hut and a perimeter around the thing, and all the grass was there and all that, and he had all these painted miniatures and whatnot. There it is again. And yeah, so I played that, and that was a lot of fun. My issue was never so much the cost as the time that is involved in painting them and maintaining these things and building the terrain, which I mean is fun. Yes, I get that, but that's just not where I want to spend my time. I used to paint D&D miniatures way back in the day, like in the late 80s or maybe early 90s. I used to have a bunch of D&D miniatures, and I still have some of them. I don't know where the rest have gone.
So you sold yourself short when you said only one of us has experience. You have plenty of experience too.
I did. I know. I was just joking.
So I think So I think with that, let's make sure that we're on the same page for what is a miniatures game. To my understanding of a miniatures game, part of the focus theoretically it's on the miniatures, but I don't think you strictly need a miniatures for miniatures game. To me, what it is that it's more of an open movement type game where
Hmm.
your units or your characters, whatever it is that you're controlling, has the ability to freely move around the terrain, usually with some sort of interaction with the terrain, that there's something else around, that there's stuff to move through or that it takes more time. But it's more the idea that there's sort of an open world and you're not constrained to moving across hexes or moving
Right.
between units or squares or circles or whatever it is, that you can really freely move around and use that free movement to be able to interact with terrain or interact with other units. And it's that movement that to me feels the most important part of a miniatures game.
Yeah, exactly. We agree exactly. Yes, it's really about the. I think having actual managers is a big part of it, but you're right. It's not necessary. Though most people that have something other than actual metal or plastic miniatures, I think, are doing that until they get metal ones. I think maybe I'm wrong. I'm sure
Uh,
I'm wrong,
I mean,
but
I
I
don't
think
know.
that's big part of the hobby.
I don't know that I'd agree. It's certainly part of the hobby to be able to have them and paint them and to collect them. But for example, there's another one that I enjoyed now a decade ago, Warhammer Disc Wars, where it
Mhm.
replaced minis with discs, and you would use those
Okay,
discs, and it made movement around the board much easier because you just flipped over the discs, and all the stats were printed on the disc, and it still had the nice color art and all that. And was a much less expensive way to play a minis game and still get all of the enjoyment you have of a minis game. So I don't think it is an aspect that many people enjoy, but to me it just doesn't feel the most crucial part of a minis board game
okay. I
or a
remember
minis
having a
game.
game like that too, using discs. It wasn't that one; it was a two-player game.
Warhammer's Discourse is a two-player game.
Okay, but it was not Warhammer for sure. I don't remember what it was called, but it was some game I had. Anyway, the it's worth also mentioning that Dungeons and Dragons, right, which I mentioned I used to play minis, came from this background of historical war games and whatnot, right? The miniatures games a lot of times have big complex rule books that talk about the movement and types of terrain you're going to interact with and all types of weapons and all sorts of rules to reference as you're building your characters or playing the game. And D&D very much got inspired from that. So if you play D&D with miniatures, you might be playing a miniatures game.
You might be. I
Yeah.
certainly think if you're playing with that open space and movement around, I think you would be. That wasn't one that I included. I don't know about you. The problem with me as I entered into this was more an issue that I don't really have any solo miniature games that I play nowadays. There were a lot of miniatures games that I used to play, but no solo miniatures games that I played nowadays. So I'm gonna maybe cheat with my first one, or maybe cheat with just a bonus extra one, and note that I had somewhat entered into this with an opportunity to maybe research around and look into what might be some strictly miniatures games that would be fun solo. The one that I found that was the most interesting to me was Elder Scrolls Call to Arms, which is a miniatures based game based on the Elder Scrolls franchise, where you have multiple heroes and their companions, and you are running around the tabletop, um, trying to beat up an AI boss and get through some certain scenarios in a storybook that you'll go through. And so there's an AI element, so it's kind of like automata type deck type things that play through it. It is not a game that we've played, and as I started to try and think about miniatures games, I was tempted to just have a list of top three games that I find interesting because I just couldn't find any that I was able to strictly beat into it. But in the end, I think I've come up with three that give you at least a taste of what miniatures gaming feels like in the board game hobby. It's close. It's close enough, I think. So I
Hmm.
think I've come up with three without having to fall back to just researching ones that I haven't actually played.
Okay, yeah, I haven't played any. And really, I only have one, maybe two things that are really miniatures games, and then I threw something in just because painted minis. Um,
No, that is best minis in a board game. We may do that another time.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, that's the best I'm gonna be able to do. So it'll be an honorable mention, I guess. My first game though is Rangers of Shadowdeep. Now I have this. I have not gotten it played yet, but this is a cooperative miniatures game, published by Modifius, and it's one or more players. And it's a rule book, and it tells you use miniatures. You could use our line of miniatures. You're gonna want a ruler. You're gonna want pencil and dice and that sort of stuff and terrain. So it's definitely a miniatures game. It's a fantasy setting. You could play it solo by having one ranger, and then if you get a single ranger, you could take like I forget what they called it, but like allies basically, not NPCs that hang out with you and also fight, so that the game's a little more balanced. It comes as a single book, but there's also extra campaigns for it. And at some point, it's on my list of games to play and cover in the podcast. I just don't know when that will happen. But it's on the list for sure. So,
One day.
mm-hmm.
This actually was one that I had looked into when I was doing research trying to find interesting miniature solo games that I have not played. This was on my list of things that I was looking at.
Like I said, I've got this game. I don't have miniatures for it to play with. Like, I have a couple D&D miniatures, and they would be appropriate. My plan is to use cardboard standees or even pawns or whatever is miniature. So this is a case where I'm not going to get invested in the game. I'm going to play it to learn the rules and the mechanics and just improvise. And that's one thing you could definitely do to save money, right? Because you mentioned it could be a money sink. Um, Terrain is another thing. People spend a lot of time building and terrain and painting and making it look really cool and realistic and all that, and then having this nice layout where you're moving the figures around on the board. The For that, I would probably end up using like, oh, this box is a hill. Just imagine it's a hill, or that box over there is a building, and that kind of thing. The cup is a tower, so on and so forth.
Yeah. And I think that if you're trying to do inexpensive, this is maybe a whole nother podcast, but if you're trying to do inexpensive minis, you can certainly also use. So, one thing for terrain that I've seen used is cut out pieces of felt. So, cut
Mm-hmm.
out a circle of felt out of green, and that's a hill, or a brown one for a building or whatnot. And then for minis, one that I've liked using more of late are skinny minis, which are flat. Um, they're flat plastic, but it's printed
Mm-hmm.
on it, and they look very nice. They're full color art pieces. Um, so they're not minis, but they look very nice, and you can still move them around, interact with them. I think that's for me, it's much easier, than having to paint or anything else. It looks really
Yep.
nice. So skinny minis is the brand name for those that I've used.
Okay, I have some like that I bought on clearance for whenever I get around to playing it. So I am theory set. I don't know what they are exactly, but yeah.
So for the first game on my official list, I think I'm going to be ranking mine and ones that are the most like a minis game to the ones that are the least like a minis game. So the first one on my list is The Adventures of Robin Hood. This
Hmm.
is a cooperative board game where you have a board, a big sprawling board that is the entirety of the forest of Nottingham and Nottingham Village, and each player plays as one of four different characters. There's Robin Hood, there's Maid Marian, Little John, go on. And the way you move around on this, you have a wooden meeple that represents your character, and you have sets of other meeples that represent the range that you can use for movement actions. So you have a couple that are for walking and a couple that are for running, and you can use those meeples as actual rulers to be able to move around this giant board. So the board is sort of like a flat tabletop terrain, all printed, and you have full range of movement to be able to move around. And as you encounter enemies, as you encounter people or buildings or things like that, you have to move around the buildings. Or certain times you can like jump up on buildings or jump over walls or interact with them. You interact with villagers as you're running around, and each of them has a specific. So the way you play through it, it's a campaign based game where you have a story that you're playing through it. It's pretty experience based. It's not a particularly difficult game, I found, although if you play through it once you can unlock harder mode difficulties. But it has that feeling of a miniatures game where you have an open space and you're wandering around, and your interactions are limited just essentially by what you can reach, what you can interact with, rather than having any sort of strict movement or grid based or action based or anything like that. It's just open. Felt very much like a cooperative, Star Wars X Wings type thing.
I remember you talking about this game before. Now, yeah, we covered it in a previous episode a year or two ago.
We did. I don't think it was a year or two
I'd
ago.
forgotten those miniatures with that free movement on the board.
Oh, the reason why is maybe because it's not miniatures, because it's just
Yep.
meeples, but it has that free movement feeling of a miniatures game.
Yeah. Yep. It's all that free on the map, and you can go wherever you want. And there's different choices of where to go and whatnot. And yeah. Okay. Well, my second item, I'd forgotten about this, and I remember when we were talking. It's a book that I have. It's not actually a miniatures game. It is a book called Solo Wargaming Guide, which is a book for somebody that is into miniature gaming and wants to play solo, but they don't have any solo games specifically. I've had this book for years, and I went through it once, and I've never gotten to use it. But the idea is basically it gives you guides and strategies on how to play a game solo, so you feel like you're having a competitive experience. It doesn't feel like it's just play both sides sort of thing exactly. And it had a lot to do with picking what side you're playing and then creating a campaign that you're going to play through. And each battle that you have, the outcome of that battle determines what happens next in the story. Like, so it's very story driven, almost like a journaling game or something. That as you do something, the outcome would affect the next game. For example, you may say, "Oh, there's this big map here, and I'm going to attack this." And I set up my map at the beginning, and I draw it out in all the different places, and I say, "I'm going to go attack over here on the left." So now I play my game not on the map but on the board on the table, and after the game is over, the results of my game affect the layout of that map. Maybe that space is now controlled by me, or now it's even more controlled by the enemy, or whatever sort of outcome you have based on the game, and you keep playing through the whole story that way. So it's not a game, so it's pretty cheaty, but it's a if you have miniatures games, you could use that as a help to play some solo.
It's a system for adapting.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
So that's a solo wargaming guide.
So my second one is very strong on minis and maybe a little bit weaker on the open movement. It is Mice and Mystics. Mice and Mystics is another cooperative campaign style game where you are originally humans, but now turned into mice. But you're a set of mice that have various scenarios as you're running around the castle trying to achieve certain objectives, usually involving beating up the bad guys. Each of your mice has stat sheets. Each of your mice is represented by a mini on the board, and you'll be able to roll dice to be able to deal damage. And the dice are custom dice, and there's full color art boards, and there's color cards, and there's beautiful minis. And similar, well, not even similar, but similar to a minis game, the boards have open spaces. You have a kitchen floor, you have a sewer tile, you have a river run, and there's a whole bunch of different areas. And they're not strictly done with movement spaces. It's not, a pandemic where you move from New York to, San Francisco for a movement point. It's open space. The way they have tried to keep it simple is by integrating into the art of the tiles approximate ruler type values. So for example, if you're on the century floor, so that's the a marble a marble floor with individual squares of marbles, or if you're in the gate area which has rocks around, or if you're outdoors that has different colors of grasses next to some rocks and things like that. Each individual element on the ground counts as a span of movement that you have for your character's movement speeds. And so some of the characters have a higher movement speed in addition to all their other stats, but they have a higher movement speed of how much they can go, which is denoted by how many of these elements that they can pass through as they're moving through. Often it's kind of a little bit British, so It's a
Yeah.
little bit further away from the open movement that you have of a strict miniatures tabletop game, but it still has that feeling, especially close to that feeling of the Dungeons and Dragons that you discussed in our opening, where you have this open world experience that you're interacting in a free form manner with these minis on the board. It still has all that, and it certainly has a very strong adventure feel to it. It's a very good story that's presented in Mice and Mystics. The interaction with the enemies has a little bit of challenge, um, and gives a fun action equivalence, makes you feel like you're in a movie with these characters activating them throughout this whole scenario, which creates an excellent experience. So I think that if you're not looking for full on minis experience, you're looking for something very guided and very narrative, but you still want to have the open feeling of being able to run around a big space, I think that it's a good option to consider. That is Mice and Mystics.
Okay. Yeah. I forgot about that game. We've never finished it. We started playing it. We never got very far. My family. The It's kind of an area movement, right? You move from section to section, and the areas are weird, different shapes. You can move from like cobblestones on the ground onto the bed, and like the bed is a large area, much bigger than any individual cobblestone, right? That
Yep.
and get around that way. So it's not exactly um miniatures and free movement sense of it, but it's a great introduction because it's very kid friendly, and it's a good way to learn the game. Does it also have line of sight and things like that
It
in it?
does have line of sight,
Okay.
yes.
So yes, this would be a great introductory into miniatures gaming for somebody. You're
Yeah,
playing with the
many.
figures. That's fun. You're moving around the board, kind of anywhere you want, almost. And then now you can say, "Oh, you like that? Well, check this out." Now you can get rid of the grid lines and go anywhere you want. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's a neat idea.
yeah, many of the characters do use. I appreciate that. Many of the characters do use ranged weapons, and ranged weapons works through line of sight, just like you would expect in a more strict miniatures game. So it feels close enough, and I appreciate that you're giving it to me. I snuck that one in there. I don't know if
Nice.
you'll get into the next one, so I'm going to delay that a bit and let you take the next one.
Well, I pretty much couldn't come up with anything else. On my list, I will pick Wrath of a Shardalon, which is a dungeon crawling fantasy game, and it is definitely on a grid, but it uses miniatures. There's no free movement whatsoever. Um, that's I really struggled on this one. I didn't want to talk about games I didn't know anything about because there are other miniatures games that are solo that I know of, like Five Parsecs from Home, which is Modifius, same as Rangers of Shadowdeep, but I don't really know anything about it. So my other thought was The South Shall Rise Again, which we talked about before, but that's again on a hex grid, so it doesn't really count. It's more free form, and you're dealing with terrain and line of sight, but it's very rigid grid. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything. Is what I'm saying. No
Yeah,
third one. So I'm just gonna throw a bunch of names and
I
distract
mean,
people.
it's close. It's close. It may even be closer than my last one because,
I, I don't know.
well, you haven't even heard my last one. My last
Oh,
one
okay.
that I'm using is Too Many Bones.
2 minutes. Oh, I have not played that. I don't know what that one's like. I would
Oh,
love it.
really? So, Too
Yeah.
Many Bones, you are playing as these gearlocks. This is a chip theory game. So, you're playing as these gearlocks trying to fight off various monsters, various bosses, and all of them are represented. So, it kind of reminded me of the Warhammer Disc Wars. All of them are represented by a disc. And you have a battle mat where you move these discs around the board, and you can flank around the guys, you can attack them from multiple directions, you can step back to be able to take some extra distance. So it has that feel of moving around, it has the feel of pretty art, it has all of those area type interactions where you want to come in a strategic fashion to develop control of the area. It is very much on a grid.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
It is a 4x4 grid, which if you're in close range, you're up next to the guy. If you're back, you are out of range. It doesn't really have line of sight. It doesn't really have the big area that you have from it. It very much is. It feels like it's trying to abstract out a miniatures game, and give you the very distilled essence of it, where you can have the area dynamics, where you can have the flanking and think about positioning without having to have a full table taken up. So it feels like a miniatures type battle without having something, without having the area.
Miniatures battles.
It's not without having the miniatures. It's without having the miniatures and the battles and the. I don't know.
Yeah. So that's as bad as mine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. I'm
So
sorry.
we pretty much each came up with about a game and a half. I think that's
Okay.
yeah. I mean, okay. Yours is a game and 3/4. Mine's a game and a game and a quarter. It averages out to a game and a half each. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's not something we know a lot about. There are games out there for sure, right? We mentioned a few others like the 5 Parsecs from Home. There's other games I know of, but I don't know of any that are specifically solo.
Oh,
There's a few that I felt looked interesting. Intro. There's a Nitro one where you're doing race cars and you play with your Hot Wheels and
well, that's a racing.
Unarmed.
That's
No,
more
it's
like
not
a
a
racing.
racing game. The one I'm sure I have the wrong name. It's a game sort of like a Mad Max sort of thing. So I know there's games out there. I just don't have any experience with them.
I mean, I looked into another couple. I looked into Warhammer Quest Cursed City. I looked at Rangers of Shadowdeep. I looked into Core Space. I looked into this Elder Scrolls game by Modifius. They exist. There's a bunch that are out there that exist. Part of the problem is I thought we'd be able to have more experience with this when we picked the topic. We apparently have less experience than we think we did when we picked this topic, and we're just gonna have to live with it.
Yeah, that's okay. Not every episode's a winner, folks.
Yep. Well, I think having confessed our ignorance, it is time to sign off for the night.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night, all.
Bye bye.
Thanks for listening. We love feedback, so we love hearing from you. You can reach me at julius@oneplayerpodcast.com or JLBird on BGG, and Albert can be reached at albert@oneplayerpodcast.com or Fractalud on BGG. Our website is oneplayerpodcast.com with the number 1, and we're also on Twitter at oneplayerpodcast. The intro music is copyright Angus, can be found at jamendo.com. The transition music is copyright by Dan Elduce Pancaldi, whose page is at donpancaldi.com. The One Player Podcast is protected under a Creative Commons share-alike license. Thanks for listening.